The boardroom of Chin Industries had that sterile corporate smell, leather chairs, freshly printed quarterly reports, and the faint trace of my father's cologne that had dominated this space for 30 years. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, my laptop open, taking notes like I always did during these monthly meetings. The company my grandfather built, the empire my father expanded, the legacy my brother Marcus believed he alone would inherit. Item 7 on the agenda, Marcus announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority he'd cultivated since business school. The Singapore expansion project. We've secured preliminary agreements with 3 major distributors, and construction on the new facility begins in 8 weeks. Dad beamed from the head of the table. Excellent work, son. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking that builds dynasties. I continued typing, documenting the presentation as Marcus clicked through his slides. Projected revenues, market analysis, competitor positioning, all solid work, I had to admit. Marcus had always been good at the flashy presentations, the confident handshakes, the corporate theater that impressed investors and clients alike. The total capital requirement is $85 million, Marcus continued. We've structured it as a phased deployment over 18 months, with the first $30 million releasing next week to secure the property and initial construction permits. My mother, sitting beside Dad, clasped her hands together. I'm so proud of you, Marcus. This is what real business leadership looks like. I kept typing. Emma, Dad said, his attention suddenly shifting to me. Are you getting all this? I know financial planning isn't really your strong suit, but try to understand the big picture here. I nodded without looking up. Got it all documented, Dad. Marcus smirked. Don't worry, Em. Not everyone has the vision for international expansion. Your little consulting projects are valuable too. Someone has to handle the small stuff. The other board members, Uncle Richard, my father's law school friend James, and the company's CFO Margaret, shifted uncomfortably. They knew my little consulting projects included advising 3 Fortune 500 companies on their Asian market strategies, but correcting Marcus had never been worth the family drama it caused. Actually, I said mildly, I had a few questions about the funding structure. Emma, Marcus cut me off, leaning forward with that condescending smile he'd perfected. This is complex corporate finance. We're talking about international property acquisition, construction contracts, regulatory compliance across multiple jurisdictions. It's not like balancing a personal checking account. Uncle Richard cleared his throat. Marcus, Emma does have extensive experience in consulting, Marcus interrupted. Which is great. Very respectable. But this is real business, Uncle Richard. This is putting tens of millions of dollars into play, managing construction teams, negotiating with foreign governments. It requires a certain gravitas that comes from years of hands-on operational experience. Dad nodded approvingly. Marcus is right. Emma, you've done well with your little side career, but this is a different league entirely. When you've spent 15 years in the trenches like Marcus has, then you can weigh in on these decisions. I had spent 12 years building an investment portfolio that spanned 4 continents, but who was counting? I just wanted to understand the contingency planning, I said, keeping my voice neutral. What happens if the initial property acquisition faces delays? Or if the regulatory approval takes longer than projected? Marcus actually laughed. See, this is what I mean. Always looking for problems instead of opportunities. This is why you'll never understand real business, Emma. Winners think about success. You're still thinking like a mid-level consultant, worrying about edge cases instead of focusing on execution. Margaret, the CFO, looked uncomfortable. Actually, contingency planning is standard practice. Margaret, Dad interrupted gently, I appreciate your thoroughness, but Marcus has this handled. He's been preparing this expansion for 2 years. Every angle is covered. Marcus stood, walking around the table with his hands in his pockets. His power pose. Emma, I love you. You're my sister. But there's a reason Dad put me in charge of operations and you do your thing. Some people are built for the big leagues and some people are better suited for support roles. There's no shame in that. The patronizing tone was nothing new, but something in his voice today had an extra edge. Maybe it was the stress of the expansion, or maybe it was just Marcus being Marcus, but he was really leaning into the condescension. Stick to your little side jobs, Marcus continued, returning to his presentation clicker. Leave the real business to the professionals who've actually built something. Now if we can return to the expansion timeline. I nodded slowly, closing my laptop. Under the table, I pulled out my phone and opened an encrypted messaging app that connected directly to my investment director, David Chin. No relation despite the shared last name. I typed quickly, "Need to schedule a call. Urgent. Regarding Chin Industries funding structure." The response came within seconds. "Available now. Conference line." I stood quietly, gathering my laptop and notebook. "Excuse me. I need to take a call." Marcus didn't even pause his presentation. "Sure. This stuff is probably over your head anyway." I walked out of the boardroom, my heels clicking on the marble floor of the executive suite, and headed to the empty conference room 3 doors down. The space was smaller, used mainly for client calls and vendor negotiations, but it had a door that locked and soundproofing that would keep this conversation private. David answered on the first ring. "Emma. What's going on?" "I need a complete breakdown of the Chin Industries funding structure," I said, settling into a chair. "Specifically, the $85 million Singapore expansion project that's set to begin disbursement next week." There was a pause, the sound of keyboard clicks. "Pulling it up now. Okay, so the $85 million is structured as a private equity investment through 3 shell corporations that ultimately trace back to your holdings. Your brother Marcus believes the funding is coming from a consortium of international investors arranged through our firm, which is technically true. You're just the primary investor behind the consortium structure." "What percentage of the total funding do I control?" "You're providing $78 million of the $85 million, David said. "The other $7 million comes from 2 smaller investors who came in as part of the consortium appearance. Without your capital, the project is fundamentally non-viable. The construction contracts require proof of 90% funding availability before they'll begin work." I took a breath, looking out the window at the city skyline. From this height, you could see the harbor, the shipping containers being loaded and unloaded, the constant movement of commerce that had built my family's wealth. Grandfather Chin had started with a single warehouse. Dad had turned it into an import-export empire. And Marcus thought he was the only one who understood how to expand it. What would happen if I withdrew my investment? David's pause was longer this time. "Emma, are you sure you want to? Just walk me through it." "Hey. If you pull your funding, the project collapses immediately. Marcus has already committed to property deposits, pre-construction contracts, and regulatory fees totaling about $8 million. Those commitments were made based on the assumption of full funding availability. If you withdraw, the company would be on the hook for breach of contract penalties, lost deposits, and potential legal action from the Singapore partners who've already begun their own preparations." "What's the financial exposure?" "Minimum $12 million in immediate losses. Potentially up to $20 million if the Singapore partners pursue maximum damages. Plus reputational damage in the Asian markets that could affect future expansion opportunities." I stood, pacing the length of the conference room. Through the walls, I could faintly hear Marcus's voice still droning on about market penetration strategies and competitive advantages. "And the company's cash reserves?" I asked. "After the recent dividend distributions and operational expenses, Chin Industries has about $15 million in liquid reserves. They could absorb the loss, but it would severely impact their ability to pursue other opportunities for the next 18 to 24 months. Plus, your father would have to explain to the board why a supposedly guaranteed funding arrangement fell through." I stopped at the window, watching a cargo ship make its way toward the port. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret, the CFO. "You okay? That was rough in there." Margaret was one of the few people at Chin Industries who actually understood what I did outside the family business. She'd helped me structure some of my early investments, back before my portfolio had grown large enough to require a dedicated management firm. I typed back, "I'm fine. Just needed some air." Her response came immediately, "Your brother is an idiot. Everyone in that room knows it except your father." That made me smile despite everything. Margaret had been with the company for 20 years, had watched Marcus grow from an arrogant MBA graduate to an arrogant VP of operations. She'd also watched me build an investment empire that dwarfed anything Marcus had accomplished, even if most of the family remained oblivious to it. "David," I said, returning my attention to the call. "I want to understand all the mechanisms. If I withdraw my investment, how quickly does everything unravel?" "The first disbursement is scheduled for next Monday, 5 days from now. That's $30 million releasing to the Singapore Property Trust for the initial land acquisition and permits. If that money doesn't appear, the Property Trust has a 48-hour grace period before they invoke the penalty clauses. So we're looking at first-level consequences by Wednesday of next week. And Marcus's position? His reputation takes the primary hit. He's personally guaranteed the project timeline to multiple stakeholders: the board, the Singapore partners, the construction firms. If it falls apart, he owns the failure. Your father might try to shield him, but the board will ask hard questions about due diligence and risk management. I walked back to the table, sat down, and opened my laptop. On the screen was my personal investment dashboard. A real-time overview of holdings that span venture capital, private equity, commercial real estate, and strategic corporate investments. The number at the top of the screen represented my total portfolio value, $847 million. My little side jobs had been quite productive. Emma. David's voice pulled me back. What do you want to do? Through the wall, I heard laughter from the boardroom. Marcus had probably cracked one of his jokes, the kind that Dad loved and everyone else tolerated because Marcus was the heir apparent. I thought about all the family dinners where my business achievements were dismissed as cute or impressive for a woman. All the board meetings where my questions were treated as naive instead of strategic. All the times Marcus had introduced me to his business associates as my sister who does some consulting, while he presented himself as the dynasty's future. I thought about Grandfather Chin, who taught me to read financial statements when I was 12 years old. Who'd opened my first investment account as a high school graduation present. Who told me 2 weeks before he died, the ones who underestimate you will make the best teachers, Emma. Let them show you what not to become. Pull it, I said quietly. Emma. Pull all $78 million from the Chin Industries Singapore expansion. Structure the withdrawal to hit their accounts Monday morning, right when they're expecting the disbursement to arrive. Make it clean, legal, and completely unambiguous. I want every document showing that the funding was contingent on investor approval, and the investor, me, no longer approves of the project direction. David was silent for a long moment. This is going to create significant problems for your family. My family created significant problems for themselves when they decided competence was determined by gender and birth order rather than actual performance. Execute the withdrawal, David. Monday morning. I'll need authorization in writing. You'll have it within the hour. And David, make sure all the documentation clearly shows the investment structure. I want Marcus to know exactly who was funding his vision this entire time. I ended the call and sat in the quiet conference room, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. This was nuclear. This was burning bridges and salting earth. This was choosing vindication over family harmony. This was also long overdue. My phone buzzed again. Margaret, are you coming back? Marcus just proposed accelerating the timeline to start construction early. Your father is eating it up. I stood, straightened my blazer, and headed back to the boardroom. When I opened the door, Marcus was mid-sentence, describing how the early start would give them a competitive advantage in the Singapore market. Sorry about that, I said, sliding back into my seat. Emergency call. Marcus barely glanced at me. Everything okay with your little projects? Everything's fine, I said, opening my laptop and resuming my notes. Please continue. This is all very educational. Dad smiled at me approvingly, probably pleased that I was finally showing the proper deference to Marcus's genius. Uncle Richard gave me a concerned look but said nothing. Marcus clicked to his final slide. A projected revenue graph showing Chin Industries' growth trajectory over the next 5 years, with the Singapore expansion as the primary driver. This is the future of our company, he declared. This is what separating the visionaries from the support staff looks like. This is real business. I typed every word, documenting the presentation with perfect accuracy. In 5 days this would all make fascinating reading. The meeting concluded with Dad standing to shake Marcus's hand, pulling him into one of those masculine half-hugs that fathers give sons when they're proud. You're going to take this company to heights I never imagined, Dad said. This is the kind of bold leadership that builds legacies. Marcus beamed, accepting congratulations from around the table. Even Margaret offered a professional well done, though I caught her glancing at me with a question in her eyes. As people filed out, Uncle Richard approached me. Emma, are you sure you're okay? You seemed distant during the presentation. I'm fine, Uncle Richard. Just thinking about contingency planning. He frowned. Your brother was out of line with those comments. For what it's worth, I know you've built something impressive outside this company. Your grandfather would be proud. That made my throat tight. Thanks, Uncle Richard. That means a lot. He squeezed my shoulder and left, leaving me alone in the boardroom with my laptop and my thoughts. Through the windows, the sun was setting over the harbor, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in Singapore, people were preparing to break ground on a facility that would never be built. I spent the next hour in my office, a small space on the executive floor that Dad had given me more as a gesture than a necessity, drafting the formal withdrawal authorization. The language was precise, legal, and completely airtight. By the time I finished, it was after 7, and the building was mostly empty except for security and the occasional workaholic staying late. I sent the document to David with a simple message. Execute Monday morning, 9 a.m. Singapore time. That's 9 p.m. Eastern Sunday. I want Marcus to get the calls right when he's having Sunday dinner with Dad. David's response. Authorization received and confirmed. Emma, there's no going back from this. I know, I typed. That's the point. The weekend passed in surreal normalcy. Saturday lunch with Mom, where she spent an hour gushing about Marcus's brilliant expansion plan. Sunday brunch at Dad's club, where 3 of his golf buddies congratulated me on having such an impressive brother. I smiled, nodded, and said all the appropriate things while my phone sat in my purse, waiting for Sunday evening. At 8:45 p.m. I was at home, sitting on my couch with a glass of wine and my laptop open. At 8:50, David sent a text. Withdrawal documents filing now. Singapore Property Trust will receive notification at 9 a.m. their time, which is approximately 10 minutes from now. At 9:03 p.m. my phone rang. Marcus. I let it go to voicemail. At 9:07 Dad called. Also to voicemail. At 9:12 Margaret texted, "What did you do? Your brother is losing his mind. Your father just called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning." I replied, "I withdrew my investment from a project I didn't believe was properly managed. It's called fiduciary responsibility." At 9:15 Marcus called again. This time I answered. "What the hell did you do?" His voice was so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Hi Marcus. I'm doing well, thanks for asking. How's your evening?" "Don't play games with me, Emma. I just got off the phone with the Singapore Property Trust. They're saying our primary funding source has withdrawn $78 million. They're threatening breach of contract penalties. What did you do?" "I withdrew my investment from a project that was being mismanaged by someone who doesn't understand real business." There was a long silence. "Your investment? What are you talking about?" "The $78 million that was funding your expansion? That was my money, Marcus. My little side jobs generated enough capital to bankroll your vision. But since you made it clear that I don't understand real business and should stick to support roles, I decided to support something else instead." Another silence, longer this time. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had lost its confidence. "You're lying. The funding came from David Chen's investment firm. There was a whole consortium. David Chen is my investment director. The consortium was my holding companies. And the funding came from my portfolio, which is currently valued at $847 million. But I guess that's just cute for a woman doing consulting, right? Emma, listen to me." "No, Marcus. You listen. For 12 years I've been building an actual empire while you've been playing corporate prince with Dad's company. I've invested in startups that went public. I've funded real estate developments across 4 continents. I've advised companies that make Chen Industries look like a lemonade stand. And the whole time, you treated me like I was balancing a checkbook." "Emma, please. I'm not done. That funding I pulled? That was going to be my last investment in you. I was going to let you have your moment, let you build your Singapore expansion on my money and never tell anyone. I was going to keep being the supportive little sister while you collected all the glory. But then you stood in that boardroom and told me to stick to my little side jobs. So I did. And my side job right now is watching your dream project collapse." I could hear other voices in the background now. Dad probably demanding to know what was happening. "You can't do this," Marcus said, and there was something close to panic in his voice. "The penalties alone will cost the company at least $12 million. The reputation damage could be worse. This isn't just about me, Emma. This affects everyone. Mom, Dad, Uncle Richard, all the employees. Then you should have thought of that before you dismissed the person who was funding your vision. This is what happens when you underestimate people, Marcus. This is what real business consequences look like. Welcome to the big leagues." I ended the call. The phone rang again immediately. Dad this time. I answered. "Emma Chen, you will explain yourself right now." No greeting, no warmth. Just authority and anger. "Hi Dad. Marcus told you about the funding withdrawal. What have you done? Do you have any idea the damage you've caused? The Singapore partners are threatening legal action. We have $8 million in committed expenses that we can't back out of. How could you sabotage your own family like this? I didn't sabotage anyone, Dad. I withdrew my private investment from a project I no longer supported. That's my right as an investor. Your investment? Emma, what are you talking about? The funding was arranged through my investment firm using my money from my portfolio. The same portfolio that's been generating 8-figure annual returns for the past 6 years. The same little side jobs that everyone at Chin Industries likes to pat me on the head about. Dad's silence was different from Marcus's. I could almost hear him processing, recalculating, trying to fit this new information into his worldview. You're saying you provided the $78 million for the Singapore expansion? Yes. And you just withdrew it? Because your feelings were hurt. No, Dad. I withdrew it because I was providing capital to someone who lacks the judgment and leadership skills necessary to execute the project successfully. Someone who treats risk assessment as pessimism and contingency planning as weakness. Someone who values confidence over competence. That's your brother you're talking about. That's exactly who I'm talking about. Marcus is great at presentations and terrible at execution. He thinks real business is about bold declarations and handshakes, when it's actually about due diligence, risk management, and strategic patience. I've been watching him operate for 15 years, Dad. I know exactly what he's capable of, and I'm not willing to risk $78 million on his ego. Emma, you need to fix this. Call your people, tell them it was a mistake, get that funding restored. No. Excuse me. I said no, Dad. The funding withdrawal stands. Marcus can find other investors if he believes in the project so strongly. He can approach venture capital firms or private equity, or traditional bank financing. He can do what every other businessperson does when they need capital. Make a compelling case based on solid fundamentals and proven track records. What he can't do is use my money while treating me like I'm too stupid to understand what real business looks like. Emma, this is family. Exactly. It's family, Dad. Which is why it hurts so much that you've spent decades dismissing everything I've accomplished. Do you know how many times I've sat in that boardroom listening to Marcus mock my little consulting projects while you nodded along? Do you have any idea what it's like to have built something extraordinary and have your own father treat it as cute? I never. Yes, you did. You do. Today in that meeting when I asked about contingency planning, you told me to let the professionals handle it. I have more capital under management than Chin Industries' entire market valuation, and you treated me like I was a child asking about grown-up topics. Dad's voice when he spoke again was harder. So this is revenge. You're willing to damage the family company because of hurt feelings. This isn't revenge, Dad. This is consequences. Marcus spent 2 years planning an expansion on funding he didn't understand. He committed the company to contracts without verifying his capital sources. He treated his primary investor with contempt. Those are fundamental business failures and they have costs. He's learning about those costs right now. Emma. The emergency board meeting tomorrow morning? I'll be there. I'll have full documentation showing the funding structure, the withdrawal authorization and the timeline of events. The board can evaluate whether Marcus exercised appropriate due diligence in understanding his capital sources. They can decide whether someone who didn't know who was funding his flagship project should be making strategic decisions for the company. You're trying to destroy your brother. No, Dad. I'm trying to teach him the lesson you should have taught him years ago. That respect is earned through competence, not given through birth order. See you tomorrow. I ended the call and turned off my phone. The next morning I arrived at Chin Industries at 7:30 a.m., 90 minutes before the emergency board meeting. Margaret was already there, coffee in hand, looking tired. You actually did it, she said. You actually pulled the funding. I did. Emma, your father is talking about removing you from the board. Your brother is talking about legal action. This is bad. It's about to get worse, I said, handing her a USB drive. This contains complete documentation of the investment structure, including the shell corporations, the consortium arrangement, and the capital source verification that Marcus should have conducted but didn't. Make sure every board member has a copy before the meeting starts. Margaret took the drive, looking at it like it was a live grenade. This is really happening. This already happened, Margaret. Now we're just documenting it. The boardroom filled up by 8:45. Uncle Richard arrived looking grim. James, Dad's lawyer friend, came in studying documents on his tablet. Dad and Marcus arrived together, both looking like they hadn't slept. Marcus's eyes were red, his tie slightly crooked, the first time I'd ever seen him less than perfectly polished. At precisely 9 a.m., Dad called the meeting to order. We're here because of a crisis that has put Chin Industries at significant financial and legal risk, Dad began. The Singapore expansion project, which this board approved 3 months ago, has lost its primary funding source. Emma has withdrawn $78 million in investment capital, effective immediately. This withdrawal triggers breach of contract penalties, legal liability, and reputational damage that could cost the company upward of $20 million. Uncle Richard raised his hand. Before we continue, I think we need to understand the funding structure better. Emma, can you explain how you were providing $78 million for this project without the board's knowledge? I opened my laptop and connected to the boardroom's display screen. The funding was structured as a private equity investment through David Chin Investment Management, my firm. Marcus approached the firm seeking capital for the expansion. The firm created a consortium structure using 3 holding companies I control. Marcus was told the funding came from a group of international investors, which was technically accurate. I'm an international investor. But you're his sister, James said. Why the secrecy? Because I wanted to see if the project was viable on its own merits, without family politics affecting the evaluation. My investment team conducted standard due diligence, market analysis, risk assessment, regulatory review. The project had merit, so I approved the funding. Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice tight. Then why withdraw now? I looked at him directly. Because during yesterday's board meeting, I realized the person running the project lacked the judgment and maturity necessary to execute successfully. Someone who treats risk assessment as negativity and dismisses valid concerns as ignorance isn't someone I trust with $78 million of my capital. That's personal, not professional, Marcus shot back. You pulled the funding because I hurt your feelings. I pulled the funding because you demonstrated fundamental incompetence. You spent 2 years planning an $85 million expansion without verifying your capital sources. You committed the company to millions in contracts without confirming the funding was secure. You violated basic due diligence protocols because you were so confident in your own vision that you didn't ask the necessary questions. Dad interrupted. Emma, that's unfair. Marcus was told the funding was confirmed. Confirmed by whom, Dad? Marcus received documentation saying a consortium was providing capital. Did he verify who controlled the consortium? Did he check the holding company registrations? Did he ask his funding source what conditions existed for continued investment? Those are basic questions that any competent executive would ask. Marcus asked none of them. Margaret spoke up quietly. She's right. I reviewed the documentation this morning. The funding agreements clearly stated that capital disbursement was contingent on ongoing investor approval. Marcus signed those agreements without questioning the contingency clause. Marcus's face flushed. Because I didn't think my own sister would sabotage me. This isn't sabotage, Marcus. This is the market working exactly as it should. Investors withdraw capital from projects they don't believe will succeed. You just learned that lesson expensively. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes. Uncle Richard asked detailed questions about the investment structure. James explored potential legal liability. Margaret presented worst-case financial scenarios. Dad sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Finally, Uncle Richard leaned back in his chair. I need to ask the obvious question. Emma, what's your total portfolio value? As of this morning, $847 million. The room went silent. Say that again, James said slowly. My current investment portfolio is valued at $847 million. Annual returns average between $65 and $90 million, depending on market conditions. I manage direct investments in 23 companies, hold significant real estate in 6 countries, and advise 3 Fortune 500 corporations on their Asian market strategies. My little side jobs have been quite productive. Dad stared at me like I was a stranger. That's not possible. It's documented in the materials Margaret distributed. Full financial statements, audited by Deloitte, verified by 3 separate investment banks. I built it over 12 years, starting with the $500,000 inheritance grandfather Chin left me and reinvesting every dollar of profit instead of spending it on luxury items or status symbols. Marcus looked physically ill. You have almost $1 billion? I have a portfolio that will likely cross the $1 billion threshold within the next 18 months, yes. Which is why I'm very careful about where I invest my capital. and why I'm no longer willing to invest in projects run by people who think confidence is a substitute for competence. Uncle Richard actually laughed. A sharp, surprised sound. David, did you know about this? Dad shook his head slowly. I thought she was doing well with her consulting. I had no idea. Because you never asked, I said quietly. In 12 years, you never once asked me for a detailed breakdown of my business activities. You assumed consulting meant small projects and modest fees. You assumed wrong. The meeting ended with no clear resolution. Marcus's expansion was dead. Everyone acknowledged that. The question was what happened next, how to manage the penalties, how to explain the failure to stakeholders. As people filed out, Dad approached me. Emma, I think we need to talk. Privately. We went to his office, the space that had intimidated me as a child. Now it just looked like any other corporate executive's domain. Expensive furniture, impressive view, framed awards on the walls. I underestimated you, Dad said finally. I have been underestimating you for a very long time. Yes. That doesn't excuse what you did. Pulling that funding caused real damage. Damage that Marcus caused by not understanding his own capital structure. I just withdrew my money, Dad. Everything that followed was the consequence of his poor planning. Dad sat heavily in his chair. $847 million. How is that even possible? Grandfather taught me to read financial statements when I was 12. He taught me to think in terms of value creation, not consumption. When he died and left me that money, I invested it instead of spending it. I studied markets, built relationships, took calculated risks. I did everything you always said you valued. Discipline, vision, patience. I just did it outside Chin Industries where you couldn't see it. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me? Or would you have patted me on the head and told me it was cute that I was playing with stocks? Dad didn't answer, which was answer enough. What happens now? He asked. That's up to you, Dad. I'm still a board member. I still own my shares in Chin Industries. But I'm not going to keep funding Marcus's ego with my capital. If he wants to rebuild his expansion plans, he can find investors who actually respect him enough to verify their funding sources. I stood to leave, then paused at the door. And Dad? The next time someone in that boardroom asks a question about risk management or contingency planning, maybe listen to the answer instead of dismissing it as ignorance. You might be surprised by what people know when you're actually willing to hear them. 3 weeks later, Marcus resigned from Chin Industries. The official statement mentioned pursuing other opportunities. The reality was that he couldn't face the board after they learned the full scope of his due diligence failures. Dad called a few times trying to rebuild bridges, but the conversations were awkward and brief. Uncle Richard asked me to lunch. I'm sorry, he said. I should have spoken up more in those meetings. I knew you were brilliant and I let your father and brother diminish you. You tried, Uncle Richard. I heard you. What will you do now? I smiled. Keep building. Keep investing. Maybe start looking at companies where competence is actually valued over birth order. Chin Industries could use someone like that, he said carefully. Someone who actually knows what they're doing. Are you offering me Marcus's position? I'm saying the board is reconsidering our leadership structure. And I'm saying that maybe it's time for the most qualified person to run the company, regardless of what the traditional succession plan looked like. I thought about Grandfather Chin, about building something meaningful, about the difference between legacy and ego. Let me consider it, I said. My phone buzzed with a message from David. New investment opportunity just came through. Tech startup Series B $15 million round. Interested? I typed back, send me the details. But make sure they understand their capital sources up front this time. I'm done with surprises. Real business, I'd learned, wasn't about bold declarations or confident handshakes. It was about understanding who held the power, who provided the capital, and what happened when assumptions met reality. My brother had learned that lesson the expensive way. I'd learned it much earlier, courtesy of a grandfather who believed in me when others didn't, and who taught me that being underestimated was just another form of competitive advantage. The ones who dismiss you make the best teachers. Grandfather Chin had been right about that.